I was the last caretaker of the church that was buried alive, Part 3. Chapter 18. The Inverted Cross. When I rose from the floor of the covenant chamber, I no longer felt like I was walking on earth. The sensation was one of buoyancy, as though I were drifting just beneath the surface of a vast and ancient sea, guided not by muscle or intention, but by something older, something that knew where I needed to be. The 7 thrones remained behind me, filled now with specters who did not blink. They watched not as judges, but as mirrors, each gaze reflecting a different version of me. Younger, older, disfigured, weeping, exalted. Each one had borne the mark. Each one had failed in a different way. Each one had continued the liturgy. I emerged from the shaft into a different part of the church, deeper, wider, impossibly cavernous. Not a sanctuary now, but a cathedral of marrow. The walls were not made of stone, but of tightly packed bone, fused together and lacquered with time. Some still bore tooth marks. The air was rich with the scent of incense and blood. Sacramental. Rancid. Holy. The choir had gathered again. They lined the nave, facing one another like monastic orders. Silent now. No longer humming. No longer singing. Because the sermon was in me. And it was time to reveal the mark. I stood before a font of dark glass. It reflected nothing of the room behind me. Only me. Or something inside me. My clothes had changed. The robe I wore was not one I remembered putting on. It had no seams. No fastenings. It was grown, not woven. A vestment of skin that bore my family's sigil burned into the chest, a cross wrapped in thorns. But something was wrong with it. The cross was inverted. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some error of tailoring, some blasphemous joke. But the longer I stared, the more I felt it align with something deep in my chest. A sensation that radiated outward, from breastbone to fingertips. I tore open the robe. And there, branded into my flesh, was the same cross. Not a tattoo. Not a scar. A birthmark. It pulsed with heat, glowing faintly beneath the skin. The thorns twisted inward. The cross pointed not to heaven, but into me like a needle aimed at the heart. I stumbled back. The choir leaned forward in perfect unison. And from somewhere above, from the altar, the walls, the unseen steeple, came the voice. You were not born with this mark. You were born because of this mark. I clutched my chest. The skin burned, but not with fire. With recognition. Memories not my own surfaced, of a stone table in a freezing room, candles flickering over a screaming woman's body. My mother. And a man in a dark robe, pressing the red-hot sigil into a newborn's chest with a prayer that had no words, only vowels of pain and hope. Bind him to the silence. Let the blood remember. Let the bone obey. The font before me began to change. Its surface rippled. Took shape. Not of me, but of generations. I saw my father. My grandfather. Men I had only seen in faded daguerreotypes and parish records. All bearing the same expression, sorrow painted over duty. And beneath each of their images, a line of scripture carved from their own skin. Caretaker, keeper, witness, mouth. I saw their deaths. One in fire. One underground, buried alive in a bell tower collapse. One simply vanished. And now, me. Caretaker, awoken. The choir began to sway. Slow. Gentle. Like grass in a poisonous breeze. A voice rose from their center, female, cracked and elegant, wrapped in decades of dust. The widow Ashcroft. Clothed now in the same vestment as the others, her eyes hidden behind a veil soaked in red wax. She raised one hand toward me and spoke. We bore you in silence. We raised you in forgetting. But you are the key made flesh. She stepped forward. Her fingers brushed my chest. And the mark opened. It did not bleed. It whispered. A thin line split the skin over the inverted cross, and from within came a sigh, long, deep, and not mine. My spine arched. My jaw locked. A low hum filled my skull. The final covenant is not signed in blood. It is spoken in flesh. The sigil inside me, the living mark, pulsed once more. And I saw them. Not the congregation. Not the choir. But what lay beyond them. The true altar. Not stone. Not wood. A living mouth, massive, circular, toothed with black spires, weeping fluid that smelled of myrrh and spoiled breath. At its center, a single eye. Closed. Not sleeping. Waiting. I fell to my knees. The choir chanted behind me. The villagers raised their arms. The voice from within the mouth whispered once more. All things holy wrought in time. But we have remembered you. And beneath my ribs, something ancient awakened. Chapter 19. Descend into the stone. There was no doorway. There was only the mouth. Its edges rose high into the nave, a perfectly circular opening formed of petrified cartilage and veined with silver-threaded muscle. Its teeth were not teeth, not in the sense of bone, but shards of something reflective, jagged and breathing in the dark. At the center of the mouth was the closed eye, glossy and unblinking, wide enough to swallow a man whole. Its lid pulsed faintly as though sensing my presence. The widow Ashcroft stood beside it, veil trailing in the dust like a bride in reverse. She did not speak again. She only stepped aside, revealing the stone path that led down into the iris of the sealed eye. And I understood. The eye was not simply watching. It was the gate. As I approached, the mark on my chest throbbed, not pain, not warning. Permission. The mouth did not open. The stone beneath my feet did. The floor yawned inward, swallowing the altar whole. The sound it made was not rumble or crack, it was suction. As if the church was inhaling, preparing to draw me into a deeper lung. The descent revealed itself in spirals, a staircase hewn from the same pale, bone-fused material I had seen earlier, but now lined with teeth. Not the teeth of animals. Human. Pressed into the wall in tight rings, set in strange geometries. Some had been filed into symbols. Others bore gold fillings and signs of rot. All had once belonged to those who descended before me. Their voices were still trapped inside. Each step I took downward grew quieter. Not because the space muffled my tread, but because the world above was growing thinner. Less real. Less remembered. I passed niches in the wall where offerings had been left. Fragments of skin wrapped in vellum. Ice floating in darkened jars. Books written entirely in blood, not written with blood, but of it. Sentences ran across their bindings like veins. The air was dense with something unnameable. A pressure. A density. Like being buried alive in breath. And then, I reached it. The chamber. Spherical. Hollow. Carved entirely from living stone that pulsed with memory. Here, the choir did not sing. They waited. But they were not the choir from before. These were the failed caretakers. I recognized their faces. Names I had read in the hymnal, etched into gravestones, whispered in dreams. Jonas Redfield, his mouth permanently open, stitched to the floor by strands of hair and nail. Lemuel Cross, standing armless, blind, but humming low tones that vibrated in my gut. Ellery Finch, preserved perfectly in wax, unmoving, yet weeping ink from every pore. They stood in a ring around a stone cradle, deep and dark and filled with something shifting, like oil filled with broken light. The voice spoke again. But now it came not from above or below. It came from me. The others broke. You have not. You must finish the descent. The caretakers turned toward me, their heads twisting with the slow snap of overused hinges. One by one, they opened their mouths. And inside each, I saw the mark. Inverted. Glowing. Theirs had faded. Mine still burned. The voice deepened, becoming plural. You are not the first. You are the first to last. The cradle split open. And beneath the fluid, embedded in the stone like a seed, I saw something that defied the shape of meaning. A heart. Massive. Fossilized. Still beating. Not with blood, but with memory. Each thump released waves of pressure that distorted the space around it. I fell to my knees. And I knew. This was not the heart of a god. This was the heart of the church itself. Its first breath. Its last silence. Its covenant made muscle. From the walls, spines unfurled. They reached toward me like antennae, brushing my skin, tasting it, reading the sermon in my bones. And then they did what I had known, deep down, would happen. They pierced me. One in each shoulder. One in the back. One directly into the mark on my chest. I did not scream. I sang. Not in my voice, sonnets. The hymn poured from my mouth, language without form, notes that were older than harmony, older than language. I sang what the walls needed to hear, what the heart had waited to be told. The caretaker is home. The mouth is open. The stone shall remember. Then the eye opened. Not above. Inside me. I saw not with sight, but with knowing. The architecture of the world. The spires buried beneath cities. The bells beneath oceans. The bones in the mountains, carved into altars no longer worshipped. And I understood. The church was never a building. It was a system, an organism, a memory machine. And I was no longer separate from it. I was a part. a necessary mouth for what comes next. Above me, the altar cracked. The spire split, and the sky outside went dark, not from clouds, from stone. Descending. Chapter 20. The choir waits below. I did not climb. The spiral stair I had descended was gone. There was no path, no ascent, no return. And yet I rose. Not with wings. Not with will. The church lifted me. The chamber of the heart, now slumbering in satisfied silence, receded beneath me as the stone itself contracted, closing behind like a throat that had swallowed its sacrament. The pain in my chest was gone, not healed, but transformed. I felt the mark no longer as a wound, but as a joint, a point of articulation where my body had fused with something else. Not metaphorically. Physically. My pulse no longer followed a rhythm I recognized. Instead, it beat in four-part harmony, every throb of blood accompanied by a vibration, a hum, a note. I was a chord now, a chanted being. The darkness around me thinned as I emerged into a chamber above. I had seen this room before, the sanctuary, but changed. Now it pulsed with dim red light, cast not by flame, but by the walls themselves, their surface covered in veins of iron-rich stone that glowed and faded in time with some deep pulse below. The pews had changed, too. Gone were the villagers. In their place sat those who remembered. Not of this time. Not of this skin. Some wore burial garments from centuries past, their lace stiff with age. Others wore robes of salt-stained wool, feathered like molting birds. Some had no eyes. Others had too many. But they were all waiting. Waiting for me. The choir stood at the front, where once the altar had been. Now they faced me. Their mouths no longer sang. Their mouths were open, stretched wide and round, forming a perfect ring of silence. A note unspoken, held forever at the edge of sound. And as I entered the space, they bowed. The entire chamber bowed. Walls groaned. Ceiling cracked. And from above, the rope ends descended once more, not with nooses, but with gifts. Bundles wrapped in waxed cloth. I took the first one. Inside, a crown. Not gold. Not adorned. A simple band of flayed leather, inscribed with the same spiraling text I had once seen etched on the stone thrones below. The words formed a question. Do you remember what you were before the bell? I placed it on my head. It tightened of its own accord. The second bundle, a veil. Black as pitch, lined with ash and pinned at the center with a thorn made of iron. I pulled it over my face, and the world behind it disappeared, not into darkness, but into clarity. Because now I saw not with eyes, but with liturgical memory. I saw the bones in the pews. I saw the thoughts echoing in the walls. I saw the faces of those who had watched this ritual countless times, from within, from without, from bloodline to bloodline. And I saw the truth. This mass had never ended. It had only paused, awaiting a voice strong enough, fractured enough, to carry its next verse. A final figure approached me, draped in robes the color of burned parchment. Tall, still, veiled. But I knew her. The widow Ashcroft, no longer human. Her veil fell away. Beneath it, no face. Only a surface of cracked, stone-like flesh, into which the lines of the sermon had been carved over and over, until no skin remained unmarked. She spoke, not with a voice, but with space. The choir has gathered. The congregation is full. The altar breathes. You may begin the second verse. I turned. The choir parted. Behind them, where once had been wall, now yawned a great circular window, not to the outside world, but to a sky long buried. Beyond it, stars I did not recognize. Constellations shaped like hands and eyes and open mouths. And in the center of it all, the bell, floating in the void, spinning slowly. No rope, no tower, just waiting. The congregation began to chant. Their voices layered, not like singers, but like scribes reciting the same sentence at different speeds, creating a flood of sacred contradiction. This is the silence before creation. This is the voice after forgetting. This is the hymn that never needed God. I raised my hands. They were no longer mine. They were scripture made flesh. I pointed to the bell, and the entire church tilted upward. The void embraced us, and the next sermon began. Chapter 21. The Altar of Unmaking. The church did not rise. It unfolded. Like a cathedral carved from the spine of a titan, it stretched upward, not toward heaven, but toward the unseen geometry that lived behind the sky. Walls peeled back like wings, stained glass windows turning inside out, casting symbols onto stars that had never known color. And in the heart of it, suspended in a shaft of silence, hung the altar of unmaking. It was not built. It had grown. A slab of fused ash, bone, and wax, etched with lines that pulsed in rhythm with my breath. Each edge curved inward like a page about to be turned. And on its surface, 7 hollows, shaped like hands, mouths, teeth. One of them, the largest, was shaped like me. Not symbolically. Exactly. A silhouette in the slab, carved with disturbing anatomical accuracy, the sloped curve of my shoulders, the uneven arch of my ribs, even the faint scar on my right hip, a childhood injury I'd long forgotten. The altar remembered everything. Behind me, the choir swelled. Their mouths, no longer mouths but instruments, widened. Each voice layered into chords older than harmony. The sound twisted the air, bending time around my limbs. The bones in my legs cracked and reknit. My spine lengthened by degrees. My skin tightened across my face. I was being refitted, not beautified, not glorified, optimized. Then came the call. Not a word, not even a command, but a pull like a hook beneath my sternum, reeling me forward. I did not walk to the altar. I was drawn, magnetized. The hollow shaped like my body pulsed once, opening slightly, as though inhaling. It was ready. As I approached, a memory surfaced. My mother, bent over a crib, singing a lullaby in a language I didn't understand. I tried to cling to it, grasp it like a thread, but it slid away, replaced by another memory, older, impossible. A stone table, a burning sigil, a voice whispering. You were not born to speak. You were born to echo. I laid myself upon the altar. My body fit the hollow perfectly. It welcomed me. The stone softened beneath me, not into comfort, but compliance. It molded around my limbs like wet clay, sealing me in place without straps. I couldn't move. I didn't want to. The choir fell silent. Above, the bell hovered, unmoving, not needing to ring. Its very presence was enough. Then the altar of unmaking spoke. Not aloud. Into me. You are not here to die. You are here to forget that you were alive. From the surface of the altar rose a series of thin, silver instruments, surgical in shape, ceremonial in rhythm. They hovered over me, and one by one, they began to extract. Not organs, not blood. Histories. The first removed my name. I felt it go, a weight lifting from the back of my throat. I could no longer remember how to introduce myself. There was no grief. The second removed my face. Not physically, but the idea of it. The memory of mirrors. The sensation of being looked at as someone distinct. It left behind only recognition without context. The third took my voice. Or rather, the choice to use it. I could still speak, but only in phrases the altar permitted. I had become a vessel of pre-written liturgy. The fourth removed birth. I no longer remembered being born. I simply was. As if I had always existed, as a role, a function, a page in a sacred ledger. The fifth extracted end. I could no longer imagine dying. I could no longer imagine not being here. The sixth removed language. Not entirely, just the personal parts. I retained grammar, rhythm, but no longer intention. I could only speak in the way a bell tolls, meaningful to others, not to myself. And the final instrument, shaped like a bell hammer, lowered into my chest. It pressed directly into the inverted cross, now glowing with unbearable heat. And I felt the last removal. Memory, not of life, of separation. The belief that I had ever been apart from this place. The idea that I had been summoned, or chosen, or sacrificed. It was all false. I had always been here. I had always been part of the Mass. This was not a story of descent. This was a scripture reabsorbing its misplaced chapter. The altar sealed around me. The bell above tolled once. And when the sound faded, I was not there. Not in flesh. Not in thought. But in structure. A new figure stood in the sanctuary, draped in a veil, wearing the crown of parchment and bone, eyes glowing faintly beneath wax-threaded skin. And the congregation turned as one, heads bowed, mouths open, ready to be filled. The figure opened its hands. The Mass continued. Chapter 22, the Mass without end. The bell rang once. Not a sound, a command. And the world remembered itself differently. The altar closed around me like a tomb that had always known my shape. My bones no longer resisted weight. They held it. The inverted cross on my chest dimmed, not because its work was done, but because it had become ambient, integrated into the stone. And somewhere above, the bell's resonance traveled not through air, but through memory. The sanctuary had no ceiling now. The church had unfurled fully, its spire reaching up into a sky that no longer held stars, only vortices of old light. Clouds spun in slow, theological spirals. Lightning struck in rhythmic intervals, forming runes that blinked like eyelids across the firmament. And the congregation remained still. Not sleeping, not praying, processing. Every one of them, villagers, former caretakers, the choir, even the remains of the failed, had become part of a machine older than speech. Their mouths moved, but no longer formed words. They released sound as offering. Vowels only. Drawn out, half-heard, recursive syllables that looped into one another until meaning collapsed and rhythm took over. The church had become a mouth. The people, its tongue. And I, once man, now instrument, was the uvula. The keeper of resonance. The weight that shapes the voice of the divine into something terrible and structured. The altar, now elevated like the head of a blooming flower, rose into the chancel. And around it, walls turned to organs. Pillars throbbed like arteries. Benches softened into muscular ridges. Stained glass windows beat faintly, as if filled with a slow, living pulse. Scripture bled from the floor, not metaphorically. Literal ink, thick and dark, pooling into spiral patterns that rotated across the stone like glyphs alive and gasping for meaning. Where once there was a lectern, now stood a root, black, barkless, split at the top like an open mouth. From it bloomed a fruit the size of a skull. Inside it, I saw the next sermon. Not written. Encoded. Spoken in a tongue that predates syntax, once spoken by architecture, by decay, by the space beneath forgotten tombs. I had to speak it, but not aloud, through the Mass. And so the ritual began again. Not anew, there is no beginning here. It resumed. I extended what were once arms, now vessels of illuminated flesh etched with pulsating scripture. I raised them in rhythm with the choir's breath, and the bell did not ring. It trembled. Its silent shudder shook not the church, but the world. I saw cities collapse into ash, and then reform as architecture made of memory. Towers built from forgotten prayers. Roads shaped like veins. Forests that whispered psalms in dead dialects. Time unraveled around me. Not by destruction, but by correction. The Mass had never stopped. The world had simply stepped away from it. Now, it was being brought back in. The congregation fell to their knees. Not in worship. In relief. The forgetting was ending. Every voice that had ever prayed into silence. Every hymn that had been swallowed by stone. Every sacred text that had been lost to fire, water, heresy. They were all here now. Spoken through me. And then I saw the others. Beyond the church, across horizons no longer ruled by geometry, other spires rose. Each one with their own bell. Their own caretaker. Their own choir. Some buried. Some awake. Some singing. And I realized. I was not alone. I was simply first. The Mass would continue. Not until the end of the world. But until the world was rewritten to remember nothing else. No more time. No more death. No more names. Only roles. Only verses. Only the cathedral and its voice. And I, once a man, once a caretaker, had become the bell's resonant mouth. The Mass would not end. Because it was never meant to. Chapter 23. The stone angels weep again. The bell had not tolled in hours. And yet its presence filled everything. The air shimmered with resonant silence, the kind that lives only in cathedrals at dusk, when the last notes of the organ have vanished, and the stone itself tries to remember them. The Mass had consumed me, had filled the sky, had begun to etch itself into the waking world. I stood at the apex of the church, no longer inside a building, but at the center of a living ritual engine. The spire extended into the sky like a blade plunged through heaven's ribs. Light no longer behaved correctly, it bent, stuttered, worshipped. And from this height, I could see the village. What little remained of it. The houses were now only shapes, outlines of their former selves, their structures softened and folded inward, like paper being prepared for scripture. Chimneys spiraled into glyphs. Windows blinked with waxen eyes. Roofs bowed, as if to listen. And beyond them, the cemetery, once forgotten, untended. Now, animated with memory. The stone angels had moved. They were not walking. They were not alive in any human sense. But they had changed. Once they stood solemn and crude, faceless guardians watching over graves that had long since sunk beneath the soil. Now they stood in formation, surrounding the collapsed hill at the center of the village. Their wings had unfurled, not extended, but split, into jagged planes of sculpted text, as if scripture had bloomed from stone. Their arms were raised. Their faces, once worn smooth by weather, now bore expressions. Not sorrow, not wrath, grief. And from their eyes, the tears began. It was not water. It was not blood. It was ink. Thick, black, and slow. Seeping from their stone sockets and dripping down their faces, leaving lines that glowed faintly red, not illuminated by flame, but by memory. The ink did not pool. It moved. Down their bodies. Across the soil. Tracing forgotten runes into the earth itself. And everywhere the ink touched, the land rewrote itself. Trees curled into spiral shapes, their trunks etched with chants older than leaf or bark. The roads no longer led anywhere, they simply looped, forming Ouroboros symbols that echoed the geometry of the altar. Even the sky had begun to fracture. Not break, fracture like a mirror slowly realizing it has been reflecting the wrong thing. Through these cracks, I saw other churches. Not buildings. Forms. Beings. Voices. One was made entirely of salt, seated at the bottom of a long-dried sea. Another hovered like an eye-shaped lantern over a desert where the sun no longer set. A third crawled across a continent on jointed limbs of obsidian, its choir sewn to its spine. And I knew them, because we were all singing the same verse. I turned back to the angels. They had begun to tremble. Not with fear. With resonance. Their tears thickened. Their hands began to curl downward, pointing not at the altar, not at me, but at the graves beneath them. And as one, they spoke. Their voices were not heard. They were read. Every movement of stone, every flake of angelic skin that drifted down to the earth conveyed meaning. A phrase I had seen long ago in the sermon pulled from the sealed page behind the hearth. The angels do not guard the dead. They guard the silence. The silence was ending. The dead had begun to respond. Beneath the soil, I could feel them shifting, not bodies, not bones. Concepts. Unfulfilled verses. Failed roles. Caretakers who had been buried not because they had died, but because they had refused to continue. They would not be resurrected. They would be corrected. The ink reached the hill. The grass hissed and receded, the earth boiling slightly, revealing the full breadth of the buried cathedral's crown, now exposed, its spires unfurling like a black flower fed by shadow. And there, rising above it, the final angel emerged. Twice the size of the others. Face smooth. No wings. Only a veil, etched with a single word. Unwritten. It turned to me, raised one finger, and pointed not at the world, but at the sky. And then, it began to weep fire. Slow droplets of heat that evaporated before they touched the earth. Not destructive. Purifying. Each drop erased a piece of the sky's architecture, constellations, myths, planetary memory. The angels had begun the cleansing. Not of sinners. Of language. And when the Mass resumed, it did not sing. It rewrote. Chapter 24, the bell rings one last time. The sky had no more color. Only scripture. Not written in stars, but in absence, constellations now erased by the tears of the unwritten angel, leaving behind vast, dark letters that hung in the void like verdicts carved into forgotten granite. The choir was no longer singing. They were holding sound, a breath drawn and sustained in a state of sacred suspension. Even silence was structured now. Even stillness had a chord progression. I stood at the apex of the Mass. No longer at the altar. No longer within the sanctuary. Now, I stood on the lip of the bell. It hovered in the sky like a suspended sun, enormous and unbound. Its surface shimmered with the reflection of everything that had been said during the Mass sermons, names, oaths, even the gasp of a child who had once stepped too near the graveyard and whispered, "What is that sound?" All was written upon its curve in spectral ink. And the bell was ready. Not eager. Ready. One final word remained. Not a secret. A permission. It was not meant to be spoken. It was meant to be embodied. And I had become its shape. I felt it moving beneath my skin, not like an idea, but like a limb I had forgotten how to use. My body hummed with readiness. And from below, the voice of the church, the living cathedral that had grown from blood and stone, from forgotten oaths and buried names, rose in one final breath. Sound is the last separation. Memory the last sin. ring now, and become indistinct. I reached toward the bell. There was no rope, only resonance. My hand passed into its surface, not like breaking water, but like slipping into another version of time. And as I touched it, I remembered something I had never known. I had rung this bell before. Not in this life, not in this form, but in every cycle that had come before. In every forgotten iteration of the liturgy. In every version of the world that had cracked open like a page too long shut. The bell tolled, not with sound, with undoing. Every stone that had ever been carved into a house of God cracked down the center, not in ruin, but in release. The cathedral in Burgos wept blood from its gargoyles. The basilicas beneath the sea reawoke and began to pulse like lungs. The abandoned shrine in the woods where children once vanished rang with hollow laughter, and then vanished entirely. All answered the bell, because all had been part of the same story. In the village, what remained of the congregation dropped to their knees. Their mouths did not open. They unraveled. Skin folded into robes of smoke. Eyes dissolved into candlelight. Their bones folded into the soil, each one spelling out a line of the sermon, like letters in cursive, spelling the name of the bell. The angels looked upward. The fire had stopped weeping. The final angel, the unwritten, bowed its faceless head. Its veil peeled away and fell upward, caught not by wind, but by memory's inversion. Beneath it, there was no face, only a mirror. And in that mirror, me. But not the me who had arrived here. Not the me who had descended into the buried church. This was the me that had always been here, the root of the caretaker, the throat of the sermon, the last name etched into the hymn. The figure in the mirror raised its hand as I raised mine. And we spoke in unison. Let this bell be the last. Let there be no silence after. Let the world forget what it was. The bell tolled a second time. And the world exhaled. The sky bent. Not cracked, bent, as if the atmosphere itself had grown soft with reverence. The sun blinked out, not with violence, but with acceptance. And all of time, all of place, all of self compressed into one echo. I did not fall. I did not ascend. I resonated. I became the tolling. I became the pause between notes. I became the bell. And in that sound, there was no pain, no fear, no salvation. Only the knowledge that nothing was ever truly written. It was only remembered loudly enough. Chapter 25. The church closes its eyes. The bell has not rung since. But its aftertone remains. Not in the air. Not in the stone. In the soil. There is no longer a village on the map. Where it once sat, nestled between the brittle trees and the soft hills that never rose too high, there is now only a forest, thicker than it should be, unnaturally quiet. Hikers pass through and speak of silence that feels like water. Campers report dreams they don't understand, filled with music sung backwards. Locals still call it Hollowvale. But no one remembers why. There is no path up the hill anymore. Because there is no hill. The ground has smoothed over like a healed scar, covered in lichen and moss. The iron cross that once crowned the mound is gone. In its place, a ring of wildflowers that bloom year-round. No seeds, no source. Just color in the shape of a circle, blood-red petals that twitch faintly at dusk. And in the center of them stands a single stone angel. Worn smooth, hands folded, tears of rust streaking its cheeks. Locals say it used to face the road. But every year, it turns slightly more inward. The cottage? Gone. Even the foundation has vanished. But if you walked to where it once stood, at just the right hour, in the golden light before sundown, you might hear the sound of pages turning. Not quickly. Not in panic. Just steady. Patient. Like someone waiting for their name to appear. Once a year, always the same evening. Never marked, the bell is heard. Just one toll. Low. Thick. Heavy with breath. It travels not through the air, but through the bones of those who wander too close. Their ears don't register it, but their dreams do. And for nights after, they wake with a single sentence ringing in their minds. Let the stone remember. And what of the caretaker? There is no grave, no marker, no shrine. But deep in the forest, behind a tree bent at a strange angle, you might find an old piece of leather, stiff, weathered, grown into the roots. A strap, a scrap of torn cloth, the edge of a veil. It smells faintly of wax, and iron, and something older than time. If you touch it, your teeth might hum. The Mass is ended, but it was never meant to end. It has simply become invisible again. folded back into the corners of forgotten hymns and the foundation stones of old chapels where the walls lean in too closely. No sermons will be spoken there, but the walls will remember. And if you stay too long in the silence, you may hear the bell. One last time. The story may end here, but the darkness never sleeps. Like this video to keep the shadows stirring. Share your whispers in the comments. Your voice shapes the next nightmare. And subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Gothic Hour Stories and Mysteries, where every tale lingers and every soul leaves a mark. The Gothic Hour awaits.